Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutin.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. We begin with the developments in local politics, and there have been quite a few today. So Bersatu celebrated its 3rd anniversary yesterday, and this weekend will witness the formalization of a new political alliance between the two largest Malay parties, UMNO and PAS. Sharaad, what do you make of all these developments?
Well, it seems like a natural step for both UMNO and PAS, seeing how, alliance between opposition parties can be successful. Pakatan Rakyat and then the successor, Pakatan Harapan, showing that was true. And I think we'll see how it goes, but it looks like it's going to have a net effect on the dynamics in the country in terms of politics, in terms of tone of politics and the agenda, the national agenda. So I look forward to a discussion of that.
All right. Well, joining us on the line, we have Ben Sufyan, who is the Program Director for the Polster Merdeka Centre. Now, yesterday, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to begin with Bersatu, because yesterday at the Bersatu celebration, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad said something quite interesting. He said, Pakatan Harapan was born not out of their own strength, but out of the weakness of their opponents. If we could begin with that, Ben, what do you make of that statement?
I think that's a pretty honest statement, coming out from the Prime Minister, and speaks truthfully about the conditions that pervaded 2018 general elections, in the sense that many people didn't expect Malaysian National to fall, because despite the issues that they were grappling with, they did possess enormous resources and leverage over the instruments of government, and yet because certain aspects or certain segments of the electorate were split, Pakatan Harapan was able to wrest power, on the back of split votes, and also the contestation, the three-way contest that we saw in the last general election. So it was in many ways a very lucky lining up of all the stars that enabled Pakatan Harapan to gain power.
But Ben, would it be fair to say that in some sense the Prime Minister is underplaying the immense work that was done over 20 years, laying the foundations for this moment? Yes, perhaps Bersatu in particular helped the Pakatan Harapan get over the last hurdle, right over the top. But without the electoral victories that saw it win the richest states of the Federation, Selangor and Penang, and hold them for 2 terms, that might not have happened.
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, what we saw happen last year and the change in the ruling party, is a culmination of perhaps at least, 2 decades of groundwork laid by pretty much a continuously unified opposition front. Prior to that, the opposition had tried to come together and failed, but I think since the 1999 general elections onwards, we saw that by and large the opposition parties tried to put one candidate in each district against Malaysian National, and they tried to do that again in the 2018 elections, but then PAS was not part of the coalition. So in many ways, Pakatan Harapan had already laid the groundwork in order to have a strong opposition in Parliament. However, the reach of Pakatan at that point in time was limited, in the sense that it was in many ways strong in urban areas, maybe very urban areas, but had difficulties in breaking through the Malay heartland. And I think the switch over of Dr. Mahathir from UMNO or Malaysian National and then over to Pakatan Harapan helped to tip the balance in their favor in 2018. So in many ways, it was a combination of factors that led to the victory. But now it is the challenge of fulfilling the victory with the promises and also the changes that the public has expected from the new government.
Now, I want to look at Bersatu specifically and kind of take stock at where they are 3 years on. Now, Ben, do you think Bersatu has the necessary machinery within the party and the infrastructure in place to be a sustainable political force?
Well, I think, Bersatu, with all due respect to the hard work that they have put in, is still a relatively new player in the political arena, and it faces a daunting challenge in order to penetrate and establish itself within the Malay heartland. In part, it's because it has to, in the last election, for example, he contested against UMNO, and he had contested in places where UMNO was very dominant and very strong. And the last election also, saw the Pakatan Harapan coalition being reliant very heavily on ethnic minority voters for political support. I mean, our own calculations, indicated that on average, Pakatan Harapan, only gained maybe about a quarter of the Malay electorate overall. And so this just shows how difficult it is to penetrate and establish a political force in the Malay heartland. So, Bersatu still has a long way to go in order to challenge UMNO in the Malay areas like in Johor, Pahang, Perak, and certain parts of Kedah, and then, in PAS in other parts of the country. So it has a long way to go. And my sense is that looking at the challenges it has in government, in translating its ideals into tangible deliverables to the public, one almost thinks that they need to have some kind of political solution in order to hasten the process of consolidating power and improving the chances in facing the next election.
Ben, I want to ask you about Bersatu's move into the Borneo state. So in Sabah and Sarawak, it launched itself in April in Sabah, and at a recent meet, representatives talked about opening up divisions in Sarawak as well. So how does that play out? Are they going to be competing with their allies, say in Warisan in Sabah, and also with their other Pakatan partners in Sarawak? Do they have a game plan, or is it going to actually be disruptive to the coalition?
Well, I mean, the opening of the Bersatu chapters in Sabah and Sarawak certainly poses a challenge in terms of maintaining harmonious relationship with their coalition partners in East Malaysia. I think one really needs to look at each situation with its own merits and its own peculiarities. In part, the political contestation in our country, that alone in Sabah and Sarawak, largely depends on who the individuals are, and one really has to look at the motives of why the party chapters were set up. In these two places, we've seen, especially say in Sabah, for example, many UMNO MPs and state assembly people have already defected either to Warisan or Bersatu, and I think in part it is to be with the winning side, but I think it does pose some challenge in terms of contestation in the future. So that has not come to pass yet. But I think an early indicator would be to see how the coalition partners work out to divide seats in the 2021 Sarawak state election. Because what we really dig deeper in the details, many of the people that have formed these new party chapters are people who lost out in party contests either in UMNO or in Warisan, belonging to rival factions and seeking to resurrect the political careers by, being the local chapter leader of the ruling national party.
Well, if we could turn our attention, Ben, very quickly to the political alliance between UMNO and PAS that we're going to see formalized this weekend. Now, it's happened once before. I think it was just after the 1969 tragedy. But that pact at that time didn't last long. Now, I'm just wondering, in this current arrangement, this current iteration, do you think this has a promise of being something that's much more effective and much more lasting?
I think if we look at the political culture in Malaysia, coalitions form, break, and then reconfigure itself over time. And in part, it is attuned towards the players' perceptions of their chances in winning the next election. I think if we look at what's going to happen this weekend with respect to this Penyatuan Ummah event, this is, I think, in my personal view, a manifestation of the two principal parties' immediate response to emerging challenges and opportunities. I think first and foremost, if you look at UMNO, UMNO in the current situation is really, really very weak. Its senior leaders are going or currently engaged in lengthy court processes that may see them being put away for a long time. And the party's image, outside of the party rank and file tends to be quite bad. And by doing this, I think the immediate benefit that I think they hope to derive is to consolidate support around the current party leadership, and hope to, gain some breathing space as the party goes through its legal battles. We have the legal battles surrounding leaders, and then we have the legal challenges are certainly going to be encountered by the organization as well, because, as we are aware, UMNO itself is facing civil forfeiture proceeding from NCC, and I think we may see other things come into the public arena in the coming months. So UMNO is not in a safe zone. So I think by doing this, it hopes to recapture the imagination of its supporters, give them a sense of hope, rally support around the current leaders, and put on pressure on the current ruling party on the grounds of the issues that they are most familiar with, that's most easy for them, which is to harp on ethnic politics. And for PAS, I think they have very little to lose, by engaging in this, because if UMNO goes away, PAS hopes to capture some support from people who are leaving UMNO but not willing to support the haze. And at the same time, it helps to also preserve their own support base in the northeastern corner and the northern parts also.
Ben, if I could just jump in there, in the last minutes that we have, the message that they're sending out, one is about the Ummah, which is specifically about the faith community, but they also seem to be reaching out to the larger national community. They're saying they don't want to alienate anybody. At the same time, it's a message that's specific to Muslims. MIC and MCA seem to be in the mix, but these are parties with hardly any representation. And so, is there a mixed message situation going on? Are they speaking with forked tongues?
I think, no, there are no mixed messages there. I think it's quite clear, because these guys look at the electoral numbers coming from the last election, and they think that, PAS plus UMNO certainly will have a large majority of the Malay votes, and that they don't really need the ethnic minorities votes in order to wrest power in the next election. So, I mean, they're fighting the last battle. They're fighting 2018 in their minds, I think the next election is going to be very different, and the configuration of the political arena probably will change as well. I think they should not underestimate the opponents. They're not going against Pakatan Harapan, they're going against Dr. Mahathir. So long as I think he leaves and brings amongst us, I think he's going to develop a strategy to thwart these guys.
Ben, thank you so much for speaking with us now. That's, I guess, a look at local politics. After this, we're going to be turning our attention to the skies, more specifically the haze. So stay tuned to consider this. We'll be back. Thanks for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kutan. Of course, the haze rages on. Now, the latest news on this is that Indonesian authorities have sealed a plot of land in Riau, which belongs to a subsidiary of a Malaysian firm, for allegedly being involved in forest fires that contributed to the haze in the region. Now, as the Indonesian government has named 4 palm oil companies with Malaysian links, including a unit of IOI Corporation and a unit of Sime Darby Plantations. Joining us on the line to help us understand why efforts to tackle the haze have not yet been yielding the results we want, we have Dr. Helena Varkey, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of International and Strategic Studies at University of Malaya. Thank you so much for joining us on the line today, Helena. Now, what is your assessment, if I could begin with your assessment of the Malaysian government's response to the haze?
Yeah, thanks for having me. What I would see as the Malaysian response is actually not very much different from the previous years. And the only unique thing that I would say here is that there seems to be a bit of disconnect between how the Ministry of Environment is responding as well as the Ministry of Plantations is responding. Ministry of Environment has basically said, in response to the 4 companies that have been indicated by Indonesia, Indonesia should just go ahead and bring the law in, no matter who these companies are, if they are Malaysian or not. However, for the Ministry of Plantations, they basically responded and said that, this is something that is not a good sign, and we should be very careful when we are approaching this issue, because it's going to play into the whole larger debate about the EU trying to ban palm oil. So there's a bit of a disconnect between Malaysian responses here.
Helena, the question of, going after culprits is, of course, well and good, but what about the preventative aspects of the mechanisms and talks and discussions they've had over the years? I mean, surely we don't want to get to a point where everybody's choking, and even though it serves some sort of sense of justice to have people put in the dock for those actions, wouldn't it be better not to get to this point? I mean, why haven't those mechanisms prevented the situation in the first place?
Of course, preventive action is always preferable. However, it is a bit complicated in the sense of the scale of the problem being a regional problem, and therefore prevention is nothing much that Malaysia can do, even though we do have a lot of agreements with Indonesia. However, Indonesia essentially has the last say. For example, I think about 5-6 years ago, we had the MOU with Indonesia, which is Malaysia and Indonesia training firefighters, training farmers, and training plantation managers to handle land use effectively to avoid fires. However, Indonesia failed to renew that MOU recently. I believe it was last year. So these kind of preventive measures are not consistent. So that's part of the problem on the regional level. And locally, Indonesia is doing quite a lot. Like Jokowi has been quite active dealing with the haze, especially since he came on board just before the big haze season in 2015. However, one of the big things that he's put into place is the BRG, which is the Peatland Restoration Agency. And it was very active going on a few years back when it just started 2016. However, along the years, when there hasn't been a big haze incident, the focus on this agency has become less and less. The budget has become less and less. So a lot of things that this agency has put into place, for example, like canal blocks to ensure that the water levels in peatlands are consistently high so it's not to be fire prone, they have fallen into disrepair. So this is why we see again the flaring up of fires today.
And Helena, there's also this question of, in the initial advent of the haze about, who was responsible, where these fires were emanating from, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we do have is an ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center. That seems to be the go-to place for a lot of Malaysian politicians trying to say, well, actually, we do have the facts. And how do you rate these things? I mean, there seems to be disputes about the very facts of the matter. And what's your sense of it?
Yeah, so the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, that is the regional level center. However, we have our own meteorological centers as well in every country. And of course, the confusion or the conflict now comes from the different data sets being used by Indonesia and also by the ASEAN Center. So Indonesia is using their own data sets, and we have a limited access to those data sets as well. However, we have access to the ASEAN Center because this is for the region, and therefore Malaysia can make our judgment based on that center's data information. So, of course, we would be privy to that, and logically as well, the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center would be more of a neutral ground because it would actually not necessarily have any political interest in what kind of data that they want to perceive. So for Indonesia, Indonesia has actually backtracked slightly, saying that only in that particular day did they find that there was no haze floating over into Malaysia. But still, it's a bit of a sensitive issue. Indonesia would be not too fast to admit that they are spreading haze to Malaysia, partially because in the past few years, Jokowi has been very proud of the fact that he has always said that, there may be fires in Indonesia, but Indonesia is no longer contributing to regional haze, partly or rather largely because of his own efforts in the country. So I think Indonesia is very reluctant to sort of admit defeat in this sense because they are actually claiming victory for so many years already.
Well, okay, so there is also the goal of making ASEAN haze-free by 2020. Is that just a pipe dream?
Yeah, the situation with, or rather the goal of a haze-free ASEAN is something that is a bit, I would say it is kind of a very distant future right now, seeing how we are experiencing the haze now.
Right.
But then again, the point is that every single year, the circumstances change. Circumstances on the ground change, and also circumstances in the weather changes as well. So, for example, the past few years, whatever happened on the ground, the weather was favorable, and that's why we did not have haze. So maybe next year we won't know. We may have a wet year, there may be a haze-free ASEAN next year. However, that does not mean that it will be consistently haze-free unless things on the ground continue to improve, and really there will be situations, the situation on the ground will be fixed from all its flaws that we face now.
Right. Well, I'm just wondering whether all these efforts are purely G to G, government to government. I mean, does civil society, have a say in this? Can we get involved? How do people encourage the government to act? Because this is all affecting us, right?
Right. Civil society in Indonesia has been quite strong. There has been a civil suit actually that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, that found Jokowi and his administration guilty for not carrying out his promises regarding to certain aspects of fire control, specifically in releasing the information of the ownership of land, so increasing transparency in land ownership in Indonesia. So civil society over there is quite organized, and they're able to push through things like this. So that's something that we should learn from, I think, as well on the Malaysian side. We have not actually reached that level. We have not been able to bring any civil suits to our courts yet. However, the certain NGOs and certain civil groups are organizing things. For example, we have certain protests, not protests, but I guess just gatherings, awareness building projects going on. But I don't think we are as organized as Indonesia and even as Singapore. Singapore has PM Haze, a few others. They are quite more prominent than us.
Okay, well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Now, we will be back in just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about social media ban and whether you're for it or against it during times of crisis. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Thanks for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kutan, and here's what we want you to consider tonight. So a recent global survey by Ipsos has found that in Malaysia, 3 out of 4 people support the idea of a social media ban during a crisis, and this is to prevent the flow of fake information. So 75% of Malaysian respondents to the survey agreed that the government should shut down social media platforms like WhatsApp, Facebook, WeChat, Twitter during times of crisis. What do you think about this, Sharaad?
Well, it's a question of what you describe or define as a crisis and who gets to define and declare a crisis. Oh. We know that in times of war, many civil rights and fundamental liberties are in fact suspended because wartime is seen as a special situation or context in which rights might not apply or are detrimental to the national good as a whole. So I think it really is a question of what you want that, or what you mean by that crisis.
Really? Well, okay, you're right. So who gets to define what a crisis is? And in this case, it's the government who gets to define what a crisis is. I'm really surprised at the results of the survey. I didn't realize so many people were willing to give up channels of communication back to the government. You think about giving up some of your free speech during this time because of the fear of false information.
Yeah, and fear is very important. I think you pinned it right. So you hit the nail on the head, because when you have fear, and fear is pervasive and crisis often generates fear, the first things that go are people's sense of their own empowerment, right? So they don't feel empowered. And they want somebody to step in to help them out. And this,
do we want the government to?
And the government is often that which they look for, right? Because it's strong, it's empowered, it's got resources. People don't look to themselves and don't perhaps trust themselves or their neighbors to do the right thing. And I think that is probably part of the problem. There is a trust deficit, not so much with the government or the state, but actually with our neighbors and our fellow citizens.
Well, so I went back to take a look at the survey and looked at the time period in which the survey was done. And it was done about a month after the terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka. That was during Easter Sunday in April. So perhaps the sentiment was still there. People are still reeling from this crisis, saying, look, we never want this tragedy to happen again. And, should it happen again, we're yielding our democratic right to kind of free speech to the government for you to control channels of communication. But I think there are problems here, not just in terms of who gets to define what a crisis is, but, if such a ban is put in place, is it going to be temporary? How long, will it be? Who gets to determine that? And the other thing is, in the absence of information, when there is a vacuum, speculation fills it, right? So even if you cancel all social platforms, what then fills it?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by the results, Melissa, but I personally wouldn't agree to it.
Okay,
so
you wouldn't?
I wouldn't.
All right.
I wouldn't agree, but I understand where people are coming from. And if you look at the specifics of the Sri Lankan situation, it wasn't so much the terror attacks, but also the aftermath, that in a situation where people will be blaming other communities, or you could incite mobs to violence against, especially in this case, Muslims, you would want perhaps to think of a way of dialing down on the noise. So that could be, again, another reason why people would support such a ban.
Yeah. Well, the good news is we have the Minister of Communications and Multimedia, Goping Sindio, saying that the government will not ban social media platforms, even temporarily, in the event of a crisis or a terrorist attack. He's quite confident that we have sufficient laws for that. All right, that's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kutan. We will be back with you on Monday at 10 p.m. for another edition of Consider This, only on Astro AWANI. Good evening.